Hey Josh, I know you're keeping tabs on the calendar. You know, Valentine's Day is right around the corner. You're a pretty romantic guy. How did your proposal go?
Well, good news and bad news. Bad news is I haven't proposed yet, but the good news is she did say yes, we are moving in together.
What do you mean?
Well, we figured we would kind of test drive the car before we buy it. It's a good idea to see if we can make our relationship work before we take that next step of marriage.
Huh. I wonder, do you think that there are real life or practical reasons why maybe even Christians could move together before they marry?
Oh, I just assumed it was all about the money. Is there disagreement about this in the Christian community?
Oh, we should definitely talk about this.
Okay, sounds good.
Welcome everybody to today's episode on Kingdom Thinking. Today we're going to jump into the topic of cohabitating or living together versus marriage. So Josh, let me share a little bit of background for this.
Okay.
Different studies in the social sciences, that is sociology, anthropology, and psychology, have shown that among the younger generations over the last few decades, maybe the 30 to 40 years, the amount of marriages has continuously gone down. So there seems to be a proportional or a continual decrease in people who are getting married, and there seems to be a proportional increase in people who are moving in together. Also, there seems to be an increase in people who are married who formerly have lived with somebody else.
Right.
So this is a really interesting social trend because it not only brings up the ethical or the moral question as well as the real life practical question, but it also, I think, is an important topic for pastors to be able to think about.
Certainly.
And to jump in for how we do ministry with young adults.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an article here written by Alice Walton. She wrote for The Atlantic magazine highlighting some of her observations for why people are choosing to cohabitate rather than marry. And so she points out the following. First, cohabitation is socially acceptable as marriage is now, right? And so as things shift from generation to generation, what was not acceptable for one generation typically becomes acceptable for another, right?
Yep, like rock and roll?
Yep, rock and roll, even things like drinking, social drinking, marijuana, whatever, right? Whatever that is, good or bad. And then on top of that, she says, people are not always afraid of the commitment to marriage. Rather, they are afraid of the fallout from divorce.
Okay, so that's interesting. Let me stop you there real quick. I think it's very easy to assume the worst in this conversation.
Yep.
So I want to be clear that we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. In other words, we are not talking about people who intentionally want to be promiscuous or intentionally want to test drive, right, different partners and avoid responsibility.
Right.
If we give the benefit of the doubt to people who are looking to be responsible and take a commitment to form a family, perhaps, and still have reasons not to marry, these are the reasons why they do that.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
interesting to me.
For sure.
So why are people not afraid of commitment, but they're afraid of something else, the fallout? What's that?
Yeah, so we have financial reasons, right? So just the cost of debt,
Yeah.
student loan debt,
Yeah.
taking care of rent, taking
Right.
care of groceries, especially if you live anywhere in the California area,
man.
right? Just rent gets
Right.
expensive.
Okay.
Wages are stagnant, and then there's tax implications, there's lawyers, divorce, all of these things.
Yes.
It's difficult, right? And then emotionally, another reason she gives is that it seems that divorce leaves a different scar than a breakup with a partner, right? And so and this is correctly calibrated in terms of the people's minds who are thinking about this kind of stuff. Like when you get a divorce, it is harder emotionally than just breaking up because of everything that went into the marriage,
Correct.
the wedding, the counseling, the connections,
Correct.
the people, your family, your friends, right? There's an added extra element of embarrassment that may not be there in a breakup conversation.
Right. So is it worth the risk?
Right, precisely.
If you can perhaps still have the same benefits.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we see middle-class folks in general and women in particular often have to pay the heavier load for divorce in some ways, since it can typically be easier for a male to walk out on a family
That's interesting.
than for a female.
Okay.
Some more people are skeptical of the value of marriage based on the experience with their parents, peers, or church authorities. And this is one that probably holds the most weight to me anecdotally. There a lot of people I've heard who have done this, who, I had a terrible example of marriage, or marriage between my mom and dad was so bad that I don't want to get married. So they are just as serious about their commitment to their partner.
Yeah.
But the idea of the marriage feels like it locks in whatever negative expectation they had or experience they
poisoned
absorbed.
or tainted.
Yeah.
Good.
Various pop culture icons, right? J-Lo, Kim K, Brad Pitt, they represent a less than ideal marriage, divorce, remarriage model for young people who do not necessarily wish to go through that, right?
So
that
seems like a positive thing, right? Like, I don't want a just fantasy idea of marriage. I want something serious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we've got the media's suspect portrayal that one of two marriages is destined to fail both among religious and non-religious circles, right? And this kind of poisons the well, or it kind of creates a negative bias among younger people. Because that risk is so high, particularly when you look at the cost of the average American wedding being in the tens of thousands of dollars. There,
right.
Somebody has to pay for that.
Correct. Is that worth it?
And then the last thing she cites is cohabitation is more attractive to younger generations who have a broader view on gender roles in comparison to the more traditional
This one's interesting to me.
Yeah, this places the less of a financial burden to provide solely on the man, and it possibly kind of takes away the expectation for the woman to be a stay-at-home mom without a career.
Yeah,
of her own.
correct. So in previous generations, it might have been more the case that the default understanding of gender roles was that the marriage would be conducive towards the man being the financial provider,
right,
and the woman would be the stay-at-home
right.
caregiver, nurturer, right? And
Right.
so with gender roles evolving or changing for different reasons, men and women are getting college degrees and exercising professions. It's really interesting now to think about how people might view, hey, do I have to forfeit something to get married? Where I maybe don't have to forfeit my career if I'm a woman.
Well, and the other thing that's blossomed recently, in the past couple decades is like women are outperforming men on the collegiate level, right? Like they're making, single women tend to make on average equal to or more than single men in almost any given field that they go
incredible.
into, right? And so there's this newfound freedom.
Correct.
It's kind of, it means probably a good long time coming in many ways.
For sure. So the concern seems to be here from this position of pro-cohabitation or the benefits of moving in together, that you're risking less and still gaining the same benefits. So let's talk about that for a second. On the one hand, the practical, real-life issues that are being addressed here. On the other hand, what are some of the limitations or some of the things that you're giving up from a ethical or biblical perspective?
Yeah, so to me, from the Christian perspective, right, this feels like a distinction without a difference.
Okay.
And so the idea here, particularly when she says people are not always afraid of the commitment to marriage, but rather they're afraid of the fallout from divorce. Like, if you get just as intertwined with somebody for 6 or 7 years to the point where you're just, there is an actual legal term for people who just live together long enough, right?
Is that right?
Yeah, and so it's like, it's the same idea in the eyes of the law in that kind of world. And so it's like, that fallout's going to be as heavy, right? It's going to be as painful because,
if
again,
there's kids, it's going to be just as messy.
And the same conversation goes like, well, I don't need a piece of paper to tell me I'm married, right? I'm just as committed to my spouse. So if you think it's the same thing in terms of the emotional connection and the intimacy and, all of the things that you're garnering around there, then the fallouts should be the same too. It doesn't automatically change.
Correct.
Or it doesn't. It's weird that the former is the same, but the latter is different.
That's
right?
a good point.
It's a
That's
distinction that
interesting.
doesn't really exist in the scale.
That's compelling. I totally agree with that. I also think the idea of family forming as basic units of society is clearly fundamental, right?
Yeah,
to how,
for sure.
how cultures work, societies, etc. So the idea that something like family forming could be something that's just in my heart. We don't need an infrastructure for it anymore.
Right.
I'm not a sociologist. I'm not trained in that field. But it seems to me that the less infrastructure there is for these stability building blocks for society, the more vulnerable a society is to different ailments.
Yeah.
What about kids, right? So, like, we don't get to say that with kids.
Yeah, precisely.
So if you have a partner and you have a child, are you saying, well, I'm kind of your dad biologically, but I'm not ready to make a covenant with you as a forever family?
Sure.
Like, it doesn't work that way, right?
Right,
We
right,
understand that.
Yeah.
So why should it be different with the spouse?
Yeah.
Now, what are some of the, to be fair, what are some of the practical reasons that perhaps our viewers or anybody who is compelled by a faith background, even people of faith, would say, you know what, but here are some good reasons why I might consider it?
Yeah, I mean, finances are probably the biggest single mover in that direction from what I've heard and from people I've talked to and from the studies I've seen and read. It's just like, look, sometimes for your partner to get a degree, they have to spend upwards of anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 in student loan debt.
Yeah.
And that might not be something that you feel compelled to take on.
Your social security number on?
Right, precisely. And that can be, that can have real world ramifications that follow you for 10, 15, 20 plus years, right? In that kind of conversation. So that tends to be the biggest one.
Okay.
The other one is the kind of the emotional scarring that people inherit, right, from the examples that are set before them.
Yeah.
Though I would push back on this one pretty hard. It's like, the reality is you can't choose or control what happens to you, but you can and do control how you heal from it. And at a certain point when you enter into adulthood, you have to take the responsibility to participate in the healing. Like there's just, you know, it is awful, it is terrible, and we have to be able to move forward. It's like, otherwise you're just going to continue to repeat those cycles of, and just repeat those cycles of abuse and brokenness.
Good.
There. So that, I mean, I get that one on a sympathetic level or an empathetic level, but I'm a little bit hard on that one. So those tend to be the big two that I hear the most.
I also want to tip the hat to the logic that if I ease my way into it, or if I go in baby steps, it seems that the next progression from dating to serious dating would be to move in to then to marriage. Like there does seem to be some compelling logic to that if you think about it that way. So I want to tip the hat to that logic and say, like, I get why people think that way.
Sure.
I do get that.
Sure.
I think my concern or fear is that that's predicated upon a consumeristic cycle of thinking, right? So like, what do we test? We test things. We test cars. We throw away disposable plates, and we recycle things.
Yeah.
But humans are inherently different. So I want to hang on to the idea that human dignity and human value can be always celebrated.
Yeah, for
both men and women, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that marriage can be one of those things that people recognize as the ratification of that covenant. And it's not just a government thing, right? Like, even if you're not a faith, it's interesting that non-religious and secular governments also recognize the validity of this union as unique.
Yeah,
like, the government doesn't care who your golf coach is.
Right. I wish they did.
But the government recognizes who the spouse is.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
That is fascinating to me.
Well, and this also carries a component with it about the idea of like being sexually intimate with each other as well.
Correct.
And this, to me, right, I think this would be one of the biggest cures of like the way that men tend to have a propensity to treat women so poorly is like if we curbed this language entirely and sought out relationship as like commitment, and if we really took seriously the idea of like what would it be like to wait until we had our marriage solidified before God to have sex with each other.
Okay, like even the abstinence conversation.
It would be wild, right? It would be a wildly different society if we took that seriously, just even within the church, right? I'm not even talking about outside of the church.
Just from a faith perspective.
Yeah. And so it's like, so those things I genuinely believe are the cure for so many ailments. Now, this doesn't mean just get married to have sex, right? Like there's a difference in understanding here. There, but it's like those things can be so powerful when they're exercised in the way that I think God intended them to be. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make a mistake and God can't restore and respect those things.
True.
There, and so, but the idea of like, well, it's the consumer base plus the intimacy before you're entitled to it base, right? And I think
before
that
you make the responsibility.
Well, dude, and that entitlement thing, that I talked with young men a lot is just like, it's so poisonous,
right?
And
I want it, so I should have it.
Yeah, and it's a terribly shaky foundation upon which to build even a Christian
family
commitment. There,
for sure.
It's like, oh man, you're just in big trouble, right? So
that's interesting. So it almost reflects how you view God.
I mean, I do. I think that very much.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't tap too much into like the sexual intimacy part of it, but I think there are also interesting studies that show how sex for sex sake, it's totally destructive.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
It leads to depression.
No, for sure.
And so at least I would say from a faith perspective, these seem to be consistent and coherent indicators of the safety and the flourishing that is matching commitment and responsibility with privilege. Right. So that's interesting to me. Now, I do want to say this. I have two thoughts as we transition to the second point. On the one hand, to celebrate this beauty, I want to recall for a minute an interview I saw once with N.T. Wright, New Testament scholar, who was asked about this. And the nature of the way he was at the interview, he was asked, like, why are Christians so staunch on this backwards view of marriage? And the context of this, I think it was something like, why not gay marriage? But the general sense of it was like, why marriage at all?
Sure.
And so N.T. Wright's response, I think, was very helpful, where he said, if you want to reduce marriage, this idea of marriage to its nuts and bolts, socially or financially or psychologically, then you've already cheapened it.
Mm-hmm.
Because from the faith perspective, marriage isn't about those things at all, although it leads to ramifications of that. Marriage is about the reflection of God's union to his people.
Yeah.
That begins in Genesis with his self-giving of creation and ends in Revelation with the union of heavens and earth. So tracing the narrative of Scripture of God's pursuit to unify his people to himself through covenant, then that phenomenon in humanity is no less than that God ingratiated gift.
Right.
And I think that changes everything.
Yeah.
It changes how you view sex. It changes how you view...
All the way. Because sex becomes an act of worship at that point.
Correct.
There.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
it's huge.
So that I want to end that on that point. The other thing I want to say, though, is I do think that if it is true that this social trend is refusing marriage for the sake of, practical reasons, I also want to admit that since the Reformation, the church has emphasized marriage to some detriments.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think we have to be honest and say that domestic abuse, or even just think about like American culture in the 1940s and 50s and spousal abuse, right?
Yeah.
How that was almost part and parcel of something. Well, that just happens.
I mean, even the idea that like a female couldn't open a checking account without her husband present until the 60s.
So many things.
That's crazy.
Until the 60s?
Yeah.
Okay. Or voting, right? Women's suffrage.
Yeah.
I think there's different ways where we could point out that,
Sure.
oh man, the overemphasis on you have to get married can do some harm.
Yeah, for sure.
So I want to spend some time talking about this interesting book that I read. There's a sociologist by the name of Robert Wuthnow at Princeton University. He wrote this book called How the 20 and 30 somethings are shaping American religion. This book traces the social trend of the younger generations and how it is becoming more dissonant with their religious backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So here's some things that he points out. He says, check this out, guys. 20 and 30 somethings, guess what? They're becoming independent of their families, their parents, later in life. Okay? For this reason, 20 and 30 something year olds are becoming financially stable later in life.
Right.
So you could throw things in there like student loans, college, school, prioritizing of education.
Yeah.
Right? So if you prioritize education over family, well, yeah, that's the natural result.
Yeah, of course.
You're going to spend 10 years in college and owe $100,000. Okay, so this is interesting.
Done that, been there.
Right? So the 20 and 30-something-year-olds, guess what? They're marrying less.
Right.
They're also marrying later in life.
Yeah, of course.
And they're having less kids. Now, this sociologist points out, is going against the grain of evangelical churches, which is fascinating to me. Because, like, think about this for a second. Do you have men's group in your church?
Not officially, but we have, like, men's groups
that
meet, yeah.
I would guess, and I don't know that much about your church, that these men's groups are geared towards married men. Is that fair?
It splits. So yeah. For the most part, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know at my church for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The men's group is almost primarily and almost 100% designed, the curriculum, the activities for married men, like how to be a better husband, how to be a better dad. Interesting. The women's groups at my church are specifically designed to focus around motherhood, being a wife, etc. And then how do we do children's ministry? So I was a high school pastor for 5 years. This is what I observed. You have the elementary school kids, okay? Then they transition to middle school, and like Awana or something like that. And then everybody has a high school group, right? And it's a zoo, right? And then you have a college group. But then what happens?
It kind of morphs into like this amoeba-like thing that's not really ever clearly defined or well-maintained.
Because you can call it young adults group, but then like you're going to be weird if you're 35 and go in a young adults group. You can you can call it whatever you want, but the idea is that the more specific and concrete we get with age-based ministry, the more we're actually separating the young adults in our churches.
Yeah, so what we've seen historically, right, the trend is like you have, birth to 5th grade or 6th grade, and then you have 6th or 7th grade to 12th grade, And then you have like this weird 18 to 29-year-old range. And
Right.
there's kind of this assumption that you're married 27,
Exactly.
28, 29, and you have kids, and you transition out of that group, and then you go into a young marrieds group.
Exactly.
And then when you like can't stand about being in a Bible study with your wife anymore, you guys separate and go to like male, female
That's
groups
exactly
to
right.
learn to be better spouses. And then you come back together in your 40s, and you have this roaring time, and then you just repopulate
Exactly.
the children's ministry.
And
again.
Sunday sermons are, at least in my experience, are primarily the applications, and the illustrations are based about family life.
Yeah, how to be a better dad, better
Exactly.
family, funny anecdotes
So-
you got into your spouse that
So
week.
what is implicitly being continuously denied here?
Yeah, singlehood.
Singlehood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is fascinating, because if we want to say, hey, for these reasons, cohabitation probably isn't your best bet if you're like a person of faith. Well, we are emphasizing marriage for the wrong reasons.
right.
We are emphasizing marriage as a solution for something like loneliness, right?
Yeah.
Or something like singlehood as this disease. And it is interesting to me how much we are missing
Right.
this generation. We're losing, if I dare say, parts of this generation because for this theological reason. And so my challenge, or what I hope I could be of help of to young pastors, young ministers, and churches out there, is that we reclaim the value of singlehood so that we don't, boot our young adults either to cohabitate or to say, well, I got to do something because I can't be alone because I don't fit in my church or in my social group.
Yeah.
And that we bring in our youth into the body of Christ.
Right.
One of the cool things we did at my church when I was there is we would bring in the high schoolers once a month and have them lead the service.
Yeah.
So they would be the ushers, they would be the band, the worship band, and usually like I would preach that day. And it was a way to validate and ratify the family covenant that says young, old, single, or married, this is where you belong.
Yeah, of course.
I think something like that is a more realistic alternative and a more substantive way of viewing the whole person and viewing singlehood, rather than saying, well, you got to get married if you're burning, or don't, and like, don't fit anywhere else in church.
Yeah. I mean, because so frequently, right, we kind of tend to leave people out to pasture who are single. And like a singles ministry always just has a propensity to turn into like a mixer, right? It's just like a weird, like, you're kind of perusing the room to see who your next spouse could be, so you guys could both get out of that awkward experience together. And so we have, not on purposely, right, as the church, or not on purpose as the church, but accidentally, I think we have kind of abandoned the idea of understanding like the value of singleness is your ability to answer the Lord's call to do anything, anywhere, anytime. Right? Like,
there's value in that.
To be like Paul, to be like Jesus, by the way, both of whom were single. Like, we tend to denigrate that idea
implicitly.
Yes, absolutely.
Like,
and that's what makes people leave the church there. And so they just kind of like, well, okay, see you later.
Right.
And it's like you turn to Plenty of Fish or Christian Mingle or whatever. Like, you're trying to find somebody to try and soothe that ache that the church community is accidentally creating.
Correct.
But should actually be responsible for soothing.
That's exactly right. And so I hope this challenge can be taken the right way.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we are part of that, and our desire is to contribute to that, right? Not to just point the finger.
No, of course.
But in the very real social conversation of the younger generations who find perhaps a romantic partner, say, well, what should we do with it? Our hope would be that the picture of marriage isn't one that is exclusively tied to negative images, or that is exclusively tied to pragmatic reasons for, well, that's the context in which you got to have sex, so if you want it, you got to do that, but can be fully celebrated as it embraces both young, old, and singles in the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I got for that.
Yeah, it's good.
I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I'm very, very passionate about this topic, as you might be able to tell. Leave us a comment. We actually really want to hear from you guys. What's been your experience with this? How do you think that church leaders can do a better job of listening to some of these things? And did we miss anything about cohabitation and some of its limitations that we saw? We're super excited to hear from you guys. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you next time on Kingdom Thinking.